TGB in Africa. So yesterday, being the first day of the capacity building workshop on area-based conservation, we had amazing sessions, amazing speakers, and we had a room that was full of interactive sharing of knowledge, lots of insights, and we hope to carry on that today and as we finalize tomorrow. So yesterday we started briefly by knowing each other. Esther from GB in Kenya was taking us through that session. That was super lovely. We had people from across Africa and beyond, young people eager to learn about what area-based conservation means, especially in the context of local and indigenous territories within Africa and in their setups. And this was done in a very just way by our speaker, Mr. Vusi, who is a conservationist by profession. He is a manager of a biosphere reserve in South Africa, and he took us through the various elements of area-based conservation, what that means in terms of commitment, what that means in terms of our biodiversity, sustainability, and the various stakeholders that are engaged. He took us through the various levels of management and the various challenges and successes that these types of management carry. Mr. Vusi also touched broadly on the context of the outgoing Aichi targets. As some of you may know, we are now looking forward to ushering in a new framework under the UN CBD, which is being called the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This is a framework that was supposed to come in 2020, but due to unfriendly events, we're talking about the corona and other issues, logistical issues that happened in between 2020 and now, we haven't been able to officially adopt that framework. But the CBD has announced that the COP15 is finally happening in Canada later this year. And so we are hoping that finally we will have a brand new framework with ambition and commitment that match the ambition to take us through the next decade of action. So Mr. Vusi took us through what that means in terms of the targets that we had between 2011 and 2020, and what roughly that has translated to in the upcoming framework. So we were talking about, for example, the 17% that we had in the Aichi, and now we're talking about the 30% by 2030. And so what does that mean to communities? What does it mean to the rights of the people, especially those whose livelihoods largely depend on these ecosystems? So today we are looking forward, and before I forget, we went into the breakout rooms where we discussed young people's understanding of area-based conservation and their fears, their hopes, and what they broadly think should be the way forward in terms of how the approach that this ambition should take. So today we are going to dive deep into the post-2020. I know yesterday we talked a lot about the management and the areas and the communities and the other stakeholders that are taking part in that. But today it's a day for the post-2020. So we want to look at how does this fit in to the proposed framework. What is the post-2020? What does it carry in terms of targets and ambitions for area-based conservation? And how does that look like on the ground? Because all these things, they narrow down to implementation. So we have a great lineup of speakers, as Michael will introduce them, who will take us through what is the post-2020, how does area-based conservation come into the post-2020, and what do we do as young people to support these ambitions as we move forward towards achieving global goals. So thank you so much. I will just go straight in and introduce our speaker of the day. So our next speaker is Seifa Tauli. Seifa is the policy coordinator policy co-coordinator, I should say, of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. I know most of you have already interacted with the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, especially the various chapters that we have here in Africa. So Seifa deals with the policy space at the global level. And she has been kind enough to agree to talk to us about the post-2020 and how this whole aspect of area-based conservation fits into the next framework of the UNCBD. So Seifa will introduce herself more than I have, but she's a great friend of GB in Africa. She's really supportive of our program. She has always been there, and we are forever grateful to Seifa's assistance to this. And she, as a youth representative of GB, she has always considered the interest of young people from the global South in the positions and interventions that young people make at the UNCBD meetings. So Seifa, you're welcome. We are very happy to have you, and we are really eager to listen and learn from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Hi, everyone. Hello from the Philippines. I'm talking to you from the Philippines, although I was just in Kenya last week or a few days ago. Yeah, I'm happy to carry on. So my name is Seifa. I'm an Indigenous Ibaloy Kakanaay Igorot, which is a mix of two different Indigenous groups from here in northern Philippines. Can you please mute everyone? Thank you. Yeah, today I'll be taking everyone through the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and area-based conservation as it's reflected in the post-2020 GBF. So when I say GBF, it's just a short way to say post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which we'll explore in a bit. Okay. So if you have any questions that you think of as I'm going through the slides, you can put it in the chat so that you don't forget. I'll see if I can, if it makes more sense to answer them as we go along, or if we leave them towards the end. Okay. So yeah, let's start. Okay. So for anyone who might not be familiar, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is a global plan to address biodiversity loss in the next decades. It's currently being developed by the world's decision makers for biodiversity under the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is an international agreement that that has the mandate to conserve, or that has the mandate to develop plans, actions, mechanisms to conserve biodiversity, for the sustainable use of biodiversity, and also for the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits from biodiversity. Okay, so this framework consists of targets, different countries of the world, so that we can address biodiversity loss and reach the long-term vision of living in harmony with nature. So this framework, as I said, is currently being developed, and it's set to be adopted in Montreal, Canada in December. So just as an overview, the post-2020 GBF has 4 goals. It has 21, or actually more now, 23, 24 targets that are roughly divided into 3 different groups. The first one on reducing threats to biodiversity, the second on meeting people's needs, and the third on tools and solutions for implementation. So the framework has, at least the first draft of the framework has a theory of change. And here in this theory of change, they say that this framework has to be gender responsive, it needs to be guided by a rights-based approach, and it needs to respect the principle of intergenerational equity. Okay, and all of this is to reach, again, the long-term vision of living in harmony with nature. from its current status, which is biodiversity, which is affecting our well-being and also sustainable development. So again, just a quick overview of what it contains. So the GBF has 4 goals. The first focusing on ecosystems, species, and genes. The second on making sure that nature's contributions to people are being valued and maintained for all, or also on another way to look at it is as sustainable use. The third is on sharing benefits equally and equitably. And the fourth, very important, is to make sure that we have the means of implementation to make these goals and targets a reality. So things like resource mobilization, capacity building, things like that help us to implement the framework. Okay, and this framework has 21 targets dealing with many different kinds of things, like restoration, invasive species, pollution, climate change, sustainable agriculture, mainstreaming biodiversity into many different kinds of sectors, sustainable production, sustainable consumption, traditional knowledge, resource mobilization, and participation. Those are just some of the examples of what the different targets have, right? And it's important to have a good big picture of these targets. Like we'll be zooming into a few of them, but it's just important to know that these are not the only targets in this framework. They're linked to many other kinds of actions that we need to do. Okay, so for our session today, we'll focus on one as well as like some of the closely related targets. One target 3 on protected and conserved areas. Okay, as well as some of the other related targets and sections of the framework. So that's targets 1, 2, 21, and goal A. So let's just slowly dive in. And again, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat. Okay, so this is an old version of the framework. It's changed since then, but for simplicity, let's just look first at this version. Okay, so this is target 3. This is quite often known as the 30 by 30 target. It's very it's one of the most conspicuous ones, talked about a lot in many different spheres. And it says, let me just read it out. It says that we need to ensure that at least 30% globally of land areas and sea areas, especially areas of particular importance to biodiversity and its contributions to people, are conserved through effectively and equitably managed, ecologically representative, and well-connected systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, and are integrated into the wider landscapes and seascapes. Okay, so it has many different elements. I've tried to highlight them in different colors. So first, the very first part of the target has to do with the quantity or the area of protected and conserved areas. So it says right now 30% globally. The next component is which areas should we be protecting? And so like what's the focus of these areas? In this old version, it says areas of particular importance for biodiversity. And then the following elements more have to do with the quality of these areas, right? They have to be effectively and equitably managed. They need to be ecologically representative of many different kinds of ecosystems. They need to be well connected. So making sure that we don't feel the impacts of habitat fragmentation, for instance, or that there is flow from one to the other. And then there are two sort of kinds of areas, protected areas, which are more understood as being under state control, right? And the second one are other effective area-based conservation measures, which are those areas that are not under state control but are being conserved anyway, based on the outcomes that they show, right? And then the last component here is making sure that these areas are integrated into the wider landscape or the seascape. Okay, does anyone have any questions about these different things? Okay, not yet. So this is target 3, right? This is really one of the main targets in this framework that deals with area-based conservation. But it's related to a few others, and I'll mention some. So like I said, there were 4 goals. Goal A has to do with ecosystem, species, and genes. And so this goal, which has to do largely with conservation, the conservation objective of the CBD, is very related to area-based conservation, as well as, of course, like the goal on means of implementation. We need resources in order to make sure that such areas that are for conservation are effective, right? We also have target 1, which is on spatial planning. Target 1 here, let me read it out. It says, ensure that all land and sea areas globally are under integrated biodiversity inclusive spatial planning, addressing land and sea use change, retaining existing intact and wilderness areas. So this is kind of the spatial planning target, or the target that is specifically to address one of the key drivers, direct drivers of biodiversity loss, which is land and sea use change. Okay, and target 2 is on restoration. So it's making sure that a certain amount of, or percentage or area of degraded ecosystems are under restoration, ensuring connectivity among them and focusing on priority ecosystems. And another very related target that's very important to us as young people is target 21, which in this old version refers to the equitable and effective participation in decision making by Indigenous peoples and local communities, women and girls and youth, as well as respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities over lands, territories, and resources. Okay, and this is very much related because many of the issues that have to do with area-based conservation are issues of participation, lack of participation, which we'll talk about a bit more later, but also they have to do with respect or disrespect of Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights over lands, territories, and resources. Okay. Any questions so far? None. And then another section that we need to be aware about is a section that comes before the goals and the targets, which right now says principles, which are principles or approaches or guidance for the implementation of the framework. So you can see these brackets here, there as they appear in the documents. This means that they have not been, this wording has not been agreed and has to still be negotiated at a later meeting. So they haven't decided whether this section would be called principles or principles and approaches or just approaches or guidance for the implementation of the framework. But what's important to note is that it is meant to kind of be a section that deals with many of the cross-cutting elements, okay? Or at least something to guide implementation of all of the targets, right? So some elements that we might want to remember is that the framework will use a whole of government or whole of society approach. It says that national contributions to the global goals and targets of the framework will be determined according to national circumstances, priorities, and capabilities. So I believe this was actually put forth by many of the developing countries who, for many reasons, might not be able to make contributions depending on whatever local contexts exist in their country. So The third one is that implementation should follow a human rights-based approach and should be implemented in accordance with international human rights law. And the fourth one is this section, as it is now, acknowledges the important roles and contributions of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and also the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Okay, so these are just some that relate especially with area-based conservation, but there are many others. And it's important to know that this section remains unnegotiated. They didn't manage to talk about this or negotiate the elements of it during the last meeting, so it will go to a later process. Many countries in Africa, or actually like the African group, has proposed to bracket this section, this entire section. I don't quite remember the exact reasons, but so I might be mistaken, but I think it's because there are principles that have been previously agreed on in order to develop the post-2020 framework, and they want to see if those previously agreed upon principles could also be adapted to this framework, and also because it has many overlaps with other sections of the framework. Okay, so the language as it appears in the documents, in the outcome documents from Nairobi, are currently in many places are still weak. They can be strengthened in many ways. And yeah, again, because this hasn't been negotiated and the entire section is bracketed, there's really no certainty yet what will happen to this section, okay? But it's important for our discussion today to know that it exists. Okay, so this post-2020 framework process started in 2018. We're nearing the end now. So we're having another OAWG right before COP, and then it's going to be adopted at the COP. And we just came from OAWG4. So OAWG stands for Open-Ended Working Group on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So this just means it's the meeting that has that negotiates the goals and targets of the GBF. Okay, so I see many of the people who were attending in person in this meeting. So they can also maybe answer some of the questions later on that I can't answer. But yeah, so the following will be a bit more of an update on what happened to those earlier targets that I showed. So so I showed the version from the first draft. Since then, there has been 2 meetings now, the one in Geneva and also the one in Nairobi to talk about the language of the targets, what elements they should contain, what's the right wording, those kinds of things. And the reason why language is so important in this process is because these symbolize or they are like they are what the governments who signed on to the CBD are mandated or obligated to do and translate into national plans, national action. Okay, so I hope things are clear so far. So OAWG4, again, the 4th meeting of the Open-Ended Working Group on the Post-2020 Framework, that's what OAWG4 means, happened just very recently from June 21 to 26 in Nairobi. And the objectives of this meeting when they had it was to advance negotiations so that we can have a final draft of the targets before just some final negotiations in COP15, right? They were encouraged to continue working towards compromise solutions and aiming for a text with as few brackets as possible, which means, again, like to have as little unagreed text as possible. The brackets mean that the text inside them has not been agreed, and yeah, they still need to negotiate them at a later point. And with the face palm, like you can see that this really did not happen. And there are still many things that need to be resolved moving forward. So I'll show you in a bit like what came out of this meeting. But before OAWG4 in Nairobi, these are some of the positions, at least that the IIFB, which is the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, had. So the IIFB is kind of the Indigenous peoples and local communities caucus within the CBD. They collectively meet to strategize, to define collective positions on the different targets, in the same way that the Global Youth Biodiversity Network does a similar thing for youth, right? So the IIFB, going into Nairobi, had this position on target 3. So some of the elements that were very important for them were to make sure that this target explicitly had language on respecting and upholding the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. The second element was on making sure that that there is respect for their rights to traditional territories or to their indigenous territories. And the third element is that this target needs to explicitly say that any protected or area-based conservation measures, any protected areas have to be established with the free, prior, and informed consent of the communities who are affected. Okay. So those are some of the things, and we in the Global Youth Biodiversity Network had very similar elements that we thought were very important, right? Going into Nairobi, we also had similar elements on the recognition and respect for the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities to their territories and to free, prior, informed consent. And also, you can see here, there's also a reference to making sure that these areas are effectively managed and equitably governed, same as here. Okay, so management and governance are a bit different. Management is what to do, and governance is who decides, right? And there needs to be equitable governance when you talk about area-based conservation. Okay, so just to take a pause a bit, in terms of policy language, maybe we can just look into the reality of implementation on the ground. We know that many areas of interest for the conservation of nature or even of culture, like through protected areas, through UNESCO World Heritage Sites, for instance, many of these areas overlap with Indigenous territories. Indigenous territories are actually referred to by IPBES as kind of islands of nature in a sea of decline, because nature is declining rapidly everywhere, but it's declining less rapidly in areas that are managed by Indigenous peoples. So yeah, it's not really a coincidence that many of these areas overlap. See, because many Indigenous peoples have governed and stewarded these lands through their Indigenous values and their traditional knowledge for many, many years. Okay, so the reality on the ground is also that there are many what we call paper parks. I guess you might have touched upon this yesterday, but this is Aichi Target 11, and you can see which came from the previous strategic plan. It aimed to make sure that we conserve and protect 10% of marine areas and 17% of terrestrial areas, but also to conserve areas of importance for biodiversity. It needs to be ecologically representative. It needs to be effectively and equitably managed. Needs to be well connected, integrated into the landscape. So many of the other elements that we also see in Target 3, right? But you can see here that the progress for the area might have been reached, but for many of the qualitative elements of this target, they have not been achieved. So we also it's maybe also important to know that protected areas increased by 80% between 1970 and 1985, and 2/3 of the growth of protected areas occurred in developing countries. So yeah, this is an excerpt from the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, which looked at the progress towards the 20 Aichi targets. And you can see it says that while we reached the area targets, progress has not been enough in terms of safeguarding the most important areas for biodiversity, making sure they're ecologically representative, connected, and integrated into the wider landscape and seascape. And very importantly, they were not equitable and effectively managed. Okay. So now it's also important to note that there is a very long legacy of injustice when it comes to protected areas. This and the way, at least the way that they have been implemented and understood, right? Protected areas have usually been understood to be strictly under state control, excluding people from these areas of these natural areas, right? And what's happening and what continues to happen, or what has happened in the past and what continues to happen, is that many indigenous peoples and local communities are being evicted out of these areas because of, to establish these protected areas. So just as an example, we have the Kangkrachan UNESCO World Heritage Site in Thailand. This is a picture of their indigenous leader, Billy, who was found dead within the park. You also have, of course, in Africa, very recent news about the Maasai who are being evicted out of their lands in Tanzania. Okay, which was to establish a wildlife game reserve. Okay, so this is the reality on the ground. We also have many environmental defenders being killed. My country, the Philippines, is one of the highest countries in terms of killings of environmental defenders. You have an issue of lack of participation and relevance to the community of these areas. Very often, they are being imposed without really consulting or properly involving the communities in the decision-making processes, even though these decisions actually impact them directly and impact them the most, right? So when we say nothing about us without us, it means that nothing that impacts us directly should be decided without us. And that's true for indigenous peoples, for women, for youth, right? We also have another issue, which is that there is a tendency for the conservation community to ignore and undervalue indigenous and local worldviews and knowledge systems. I think this is improving somewhat, but in the past, this has really been the case. Conservation programs have historically relied only on Western scientific knowledge for setting priorities for conservation and designing actions, even when indigenous and local knowledge systems actually are very often very rich, very nuanced, very locally adapted knowledge systems that need to be taken into account when you decide on these kinds of things, right? And so again, it's also important to look at the bigger picture. Some people like to think of the 30 by 30 target as the, one big target that will lead us towards living in harmony with nature. But even, for instance, if we successfully conserve 30% of the planet by 2030, it will not be enough if we don't address the underlying drivers of the biodiversity crisis that we're in. And if we only look at this one aspect of this social ecological crisis, then we will not really get to where we want in terms of outcomes, right? And what we need is actually transformative, systemic, widespread change. And then also important to remember is that how we reach the 30% is important. We need to remember that for any projects that impact Indigenous peoples and local communities and their lands and their rights, there needs to be a process of obtaining free, prior, and informed consent. So just to break this down a bit, free means that you need to obtain consent without force, without bribery, for instance. They're free to decide what is best for them. Prior means that this process is done before the project is started. Informed means that you give any and all information that the community needs to decide before you even before you even start the project. And this information has to be given in language or in a manner that they can understand. And consent means that it's a process of deciding whether it's yes or it's no. Okay, it's not a process of pushing and pushing and pushing until the community finally says yes. But if the community decides no, then that decision should be respected. Okay, so that's free, prior, informed consent. And so finally, just in this section, in order to actually reach effective and equitable conservation, there are a few things that we need. We need, again, the full and effective participation of the rights holders. We need equitable governance. We need participatory monitoring and assessment. We need to understand that it's really quality over quantity. We don't want any more paper parks. And we need to make sure that the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities are being recognized. Their rights to their land and their rights to their life also. Okay, so with that kind of context, let's go back to the policy language. So OAWG4, we can't go too much into the detail, but if you want to read the documents or the outcomes, you can visit these two websites. Okay, the first one is the CBD website. You can find all of the documents there. All of the statements given by the different countries, the different stakeholder groups, for instance, in plenary. And then there's also this website, env.isd.org, which is in a way like media coverage for the day-to-day happenings during this meeting. And you can see here more clearly the different country positions and an overall summary of what happened. Okay, so this is now looking at the outcomes of the Nairobi meeting. Let me know again if you have any questions. Okay, so from the target that I read earlier, this is now what it looks like. You can see again many brackets of language that they still need to resolve, that they still need to compromise on, so that they can agree on language that can be adopted later on. So trying to break it down a bit, the 30% is still there. It's currently still in brackets. So 30% of what? So you see all blank and of all blank. This is a placeholder because they took a very, very long time and can't really agree on what kinds of areas to put in this place. So this is this thing in blue are the options that they currently have on the table. So 30% of all land and of sea or of ocean, or all ecosystems, terrestrial, inland waters, coastal and marine ecosystems, ecosystems as defined by Article 2 of the Convention, or should they say terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, those kinds of things. So they can't really decide what specific terminology to put here. And then you have globally at the national level in brackets. This is where they have to decide and agree whether this target should be understood as a global target, meaning that all the different countries are contributing towards that 30%, or if it's a national target and that each country has to conserve 30% of their area, right? The next one in purple is it's referring to which areas. So you have, again, whether it's key biodiversity areas, whether it's ecologically or biologically significant areas, whether it's threatened ecosystems, other areas of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services, right? So they need to agree on that too, keeping in mind that these targets have to be short for the public to understand them and for the people implementing them to understand them. Okay, so you still have effectively, or you have conserved through. Effectively here is in brackets, so effectively or well managed. Yeah. Where was I? Yeah, or well, effectively or well managed areas of so you have the management aspect, you have the connectivity aspect, the representativeness aspect, which are all still there. You have equitably governed, which was not in the previous version, but is now here without brackets, so it's agreed on, right? So many of the quality elements that we need are still there. And then you have this addition by a certain country, I'm not sure which one, saying that including a substantial portion that is strictly protected. Let me know what you think of this. And then you have in brackets, so you still have other effective area-based conservation measures, which is without brackets. There's the proposal to add indigenous territories here. There's language on in accordance with national priorities and capabilities. And then you have here at the end, and respecting the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. And it's without brackets. So that's good to know. But during the course of this negotiation, there was other important language that was already there. All of this here down, in this paragraph down here, were taken out of this text and submitted to the section BBIS that we talked about earlier, right? And this text includes free prior informed consent, and rights over territories, explicit mention of rights of indigenous peoples and local communities to their territories. So the parties or the countries decided that they don't want this kind of text in the target, which is a big loss. So they want it only in that overarching section BBIS, right? So this is a bit worrying, because if this kind of language is not attached to the target itself, it could still not serve as an effective safeguard against the human rights violations that we are trying to avoid, right? Although it is noted that there is a more general reference to rights of indigenous peoples and local communities here without brackets. Okay, so that's target 3. Any questions? Okay, moving on then. So this again is the outcome of the most recent meeting. So target 1, this is how it changed. You still see a lot of brackets, and this has to be negotiated later. But this also has an important safeguard on the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, especially because spatial planning can sometimes ignore traditional usage of land and water, right? So there's also a need for a safeguard here. It also, spatial planning by governments can also ignore many of the cultural values, cultural areas, sacred sites, for instance, and things like that. So this tries to take those into account. There's also a reference to participatory spatial planning, still in brackets, that we hope will be kept, right? And there again, here trying to see which areas to focus on in terms of spatial planning, and there's many kind of options that they have. Target 2 on restoration, they are trying to decide what kind of percentage should be restored, what kind of ecosystem should be restored again. But it's still here, and it has quite a few brackets, right? And here also they're trying to move a lot of the language on IPLCs to the section BBIS. And then finally on target 21, you can see here that this has less brackets. You have participation not in brackets. You still have rights over lands, territories, and resources, and traditional knowledge here without brackets. You have references to women, girls, children, and youth. You also have access to justice, which is currently in brackets, which is actually also important because of the many human rights violations that we talked about earlier. Access to justice can provide that kind of way for people to access redress mechanisms. And then you also have a reference here now to the protection of environmental defenders or environmental human rights defenders, still in brackets. So sorry for the noise. Any questions so far? Because I'm about to end. This is maybe to give you a bit of an insight of what happened during the meeting and how the Indigenous Peoples Caucus felt about it. So this was a statement delivered by the IFB in plenary when they were discussing the outcomes of Target 3. So here they said, we regret that the contact group was not able to lift brackets and transmit a clean text on Target 3 and other targets to the COP. This is the completely wrong signal to send to our Indigenous Maasai sisters and brothers in Loliondo, Tanzania, who are having to flee because a game reserve has been established on their indigenous and traditional territory without their free, prior, and informed consent. While it is appreciated that the rights of IPLCs is not bracketed in Targets 1 and 3, we are gravely concerned by the notes in Targets 2 and 3 that seem to seek to transfer IPLC rights from key targets into BBIS. In order to prevent situations like Loliondo from happening when the post-2020 GBF is implemented, it is important for IPLC rights to be in key targets. They also say that the current text of BBIS does not adequately address our concerns around indigenous territories, traditional territories, and free, prior, informed consent in relation to our rights to lands, territories, and resources. So it is difficult for us to understand how our concerns on Target 3 can be addressed adequately in that section. During their closing statement, they said the fundamental role played by our peoples in the conservation of biological diversity and the mitigation and adaptation of climate change has been proven. However, many of our proposals are still in square brackets. We call for parties to remove the brackets around the language on our rights, territories, and biocultural ecosystems. And for us as the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, we reiterated many of the same points. One of the final things that we said is that nothing about youth should be decided without youth, nothing about women without women, nothing about IPLCs without IPLCs. And we ended by saying that we are actually partners and allies in biodiversity, and their decisions should not enable any oppression and injustice that we face, right? So that's area-based conservation in the post-2020 framework, and with updates from the most recent meeting. So yeah, I'm passing back to whoever, to Kevin maybe, to have maybe a discussion, or if there are any questions I can help to clear up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sefa, for your presentation. And it's amazing that you brought everyone to speed with what happened in negotiations, and also regarding the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the topic of focus during this event on area-based conservation. Thank you so much. And I can see some questions on the chat. Somebody is asking, this global framework, how inclusive and participatory has the process of this document considered all countries, mainly countries that have bad practice of conservation? That is the first question. And other people are just sending you love and appreciation for the nice presentation. I think you can be answering that first question as we wait on other people to probably ask some more questions as we move on. Thank you.
So you're right, this is a global framework. And because it is a global framework, one of the principles that they had when they decided to take this process forward was that this process had to be participatory, not just in terms of the countries, but also of any stakeholders who wanted to participate, right? The process has tried to involve as many countries as possible. For instance, there are some funds for negotiators from developing countries, from least developed countries, to fund, I think, 1 or 2 negotiators to attend the meetings. So that's like one of the ways that they try to bring people in. There's also a voluntary fund to make sure that Indigenous peoples and local communities are from many different regions of the world are able to attend the meetings, right? But of course, as always, they can't really mitigate many of the other causes of difficulties in terms of participation of developing countries as well as stakeholders. For instance, with developing countries, many of them have very small delegations who attend the meeting, which means it's very difficult to attend all of them and make sure that you're following all the different processes going on. This was, for instance, the case in Nairobi, where 2 meetings were often going on at the same time. And when you're a country with just 1 or 2 people in the meeting, and you have other countries with delegations of 10 or more, right? Then there's still an inequality with regards to that. You also have, for instance, visa issues, right? Which, is disproportionately felt by many of the developing countries and participants from developing countries. And then also a big part of this process happened online. So you also have this issue of digital inequality. Not every country has the same access to internet, for instance, to be able to participate. And that's why they went forward. They decided to go with in-person negotiations, despite the still present risk of COVID, which again is impacting developing countries more than developed ones because of the lack of access to vaccines, for instance, those kinds of things. So yeah, those are many of the inequity issues with regards to participation. But everyone, or at least like every country, has the same sort of right to provide inputs to this process. These are negotiations. In many cases, it's kind of a push and pull between the developing countries for some issues, the mega diverse countries versus those who are not, those kinds of things. And in the end, they will have to all agree on what is adopted in the end, right?
Thank you, Sefa, for the comprehensive response to the question. I can see you have another question. Gideon from Namibia is asking, what are the possible solutions, for instance, when conservation activists in Indigenous communities are victimized and defamed by people from dominant ethnic groups? I think you also highlighted this as a very critical aspect. And when it comes to environmental defenders, and I think you can shed more light if you have something more to add onto that question.
Mm-hmm. So let me just think about this a bit. Yeah, this is a problem I know I face here in my country, wherein many of the Indigenous activists and conservation activists are being criminalized, right, for the work that they do. They're being thought of as terrorists. They're being labeled as terrorists. They're being charged usually with made-up cases so that they can put them in jail and then have to pay insane amounts of bail, for instance, in order to get out. So this is a problem in many places. and it even happens to like high profile activists as well as people who are more grassroots and community based. The solutions, it's difficult to point out. There are many things that have to be done, right? First, like governance wise, I think there needs to be good governance that respects the rights, like that puts a lot of value in respecting human rights. This is essentially a situation wherein some people are not being treated as equal to all other people. Policy wise, there can be something done. For instance, this post 2020 framework at the global level can create that sort of global recognition that this situation is happening and that we need to ensure access to justice for environmental defenders, but also at the national level. So it's not just this post 2020 framework, at the regional level as well. So you have, for instance, regional agreements in Latin America and the Caribbean and in Europe, making sure that environmental defenders have access to justice. So that's something that can be done in other regions as well, and at the national level, right? There also just needs to be this formal mechanisms so that any victims can receive access to justice or access to redress in case this happens. And finally, like many of the solutions, well, I don't know. I don't really know what like the best solutions are. It's just a very upsetting situation, honestly, because what many people are trying to do in many instances, they are governments. They try to do this so that people are kind of scared to resist and to become activists. And what's upsetting is that if you are scared by their actions, I mean, essentially that's kind of what they're trying to do. So I don't know the best solutions. There are also many grassroots and advocacy ways to do it, and I know this is also being felt by many young people, but yeah, those are some of the things I can mention.
Thank you, Sefa. I think we are now going to take the last question. And then if you have more questions for Sefa, you can still rate them to us. We can rate them to her, and then she can respond to via email, because I can see we are really constrained with time, and we also have a need to engage the next speaker for the day. So the last question, Sefa, is from John, and he's asking, with the focus of indigenous communities, in the case for the Tanzania, how has the GBN, or even how can Tanzanian Youth Biodiversity Network change the mindset of these local communities so as to ensure sustainable conservation of natural resources? I think now this is turning tables towards the communities as well. And I don't know if you have something to also add on to that. And then we can see if you have more questions, we can send them to you and see if you can respond to them even when you're away from the chat.
Okay, I'm not sure I fully understand the question. And the context, maybe there's someone here who can better, who is more familiar with the situation, who can answer better. Yeah, I don't know if I fully understand the question.
I feel that probably John might want to unmute and provide clarity on the question. If John is on the chat, you can unmute and provide clarity on your question as well.
Okay,
list-
so I'm
listed-
reading again, and maybe I understand a bit. Okay, so, and let me know if I'm not. But again, the way that conservation has been historically done has created a bad reputation for conservation as a practice for indigenous peoples and local communities, wherein because it's being done in such a, like in many different kinds of unjust ways, communities can tend to see conservation actions as all bad, and that's not the fault of the communities. It's because that has been their lived experience, right? And what the conservation community needs to do is to build legitimacy for the actions that they do. And this means making sure that any actions that they do don't disrespect indigenous peoples and community rights. And yeah, rather are actually helpful in terms of promoting and recognizing these rights. So it's, yeah, sometimes well, it's a widespread worldview by many people that pursuing the welfare of people and pursuing conservation outcomes are somehow in conflict with each other. But that's definitely not the case, right? And you need to pursue both so that both can thrive. Yeah, I'm not sure if I answered the question, but that's what I have to say about that.
All right, thank you so much, Sefa, for your comprehensive presentation, and also helping us to like have those leverage points on how we can intervene as young people to help realize the various targets of the framework to ensure that it is indeed a framework that is whole of government and whole of society. We are indebted to you for creating time to come to this event and provide context on the topic of area-based conservation. So thank you so much. If we have more questions, we're going to follow up with you, and we are sure that you're going to be just an email away. So thank you so much, Sefa. So guys, we're going to go to the next presentation, and we are going to have a presentation from Ramson. He is one of the representatives of the indigenous communities from Kenya, and he's the Field Research and Logistics Coordinator of Impact Trust Kenya, and he's going to provide us with insights and perspectives on free and prior informed consent when it comes to the inclusive engagement of indigenous people and local communities. So Ramson, you're very much welcome to take the floor and provide us with your insights on this topic.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah,
Hi, morning, Ramson. We can hear you. Yes, you can take the floor.
Thank you so much. I think I'm seeing Esther is the one who is welcoming me. Thank you so much, Esther, and I'm happy and it's a privilege to be here. I'm happy to share maybe a few or lead in a discussion, which I don't think I will be the one we will be discussing mostly. I don't want to leave this as my discussion, but I hope we can discuss about the EFIC process and the EFIC tool, which is something very important for us as indigenous peoples and local communities. But yeah, allow me first of all to introduce myself. As Esther said, my name is Ramson Karamushu, and I work for a local non-government organization. It's known as Impact. Impact are the initials. It stands for the Indigenous Movement for Peace, Advancement, and Conflict Transformation. It's a long name. We have quite a number of thematic areas that we work with, but I think the name defines us. We work with the indigenous and local communities up in northern Kenya. And we also create or find linkages to other indigenous peoples globally or regional and globally through the networks of indigenous peoples like IIFP, the ICA Consortia, and some others that we are developing. We have like Paran Alliance, which mostly operates in Kenya and trying to expand to the East Africa, and Arise Africa, which we are talking about the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, mostly in Africa. Sorry, I'm a bit in a place where there are things going on, and sometimes I could be disturbed, but I hope it will allow me to continue. Yes, I hope there is no any question up to that point. In Impact, I work as a research, learning, and advocacy manager, and we operate with different kind of teams, still in Northern Kenya, but we also work with academia institutions, both locally in Kenya and also globally outside the country. We also work with local, not local, but individual researchers from different institutions, also locally and globally. So I'm happy to, yes, to say that that's me. I've been working in the organization for around 6-7 years now. Yes, if I can be allowed, I would like to share a screen. Is that okay? I don't know what's happening. Okay, yeah, here. Okay, so I think I would like to discuss about FPIC, yes, and just to take you a bit through about the FPIC. I think this is something that maybe we all know. When we talk, someone is coming in, I admit. And I think, yes, as we need to talk about FPIC, FPIC, if I may say, is a process. And FPIC, which stands for free, prior, and informed consent, each and every one of these letters has got its own meaning. So I tried to this really shows that free means the community are given room to decide on the things, or not to decide, but they are given the information freely, without any kind of intimidation, without any kind of coercion, without any kind of manipulation of the information. You're giving the right information of what you want to do to the community for them to be able to analyze, decide, and give consent or say no to it. So it's self-directed thing that the communities have to sit down, discuss. It's not for a few people in the community, it's for everyone, and it's free. And not that some people have got a privilege to have it and some people do not have the privilege to have it. It's free for everyone. And the other thing is about, I don't know, this thing is moving, okay. Prior. This means that the consent is sought sufficiently in advance of any authorization or commencement of activities at the early stages of development of an investment or a plan or any kind of project, and not when the things go in a different direction. You bring this prior to doing anything at the community area. You bring these discussions at the beginning of maybe thinking of doing a project in a community where, whether it is an investment, whether it's a different kind of land use plan, asking communities to maybe move to a different direction to allow some use of land, maybe conservation of wildlife or anything. You have to do it prior. Sometimes these discussions about giving consent to community areas comes later after things are really going in a very different direction. That's when people are coming now to discuss about giving consent. So it always doesn't take a very good shape when you bring it when the problems are coming up. So I think it's always good to bring it prior to doing anything so that you have a go ahead by everyone in the community, or you have to change strategy, changing. It's not really a matter that you completely stop what you are doing, but you can also change the few things that maybe the community are not happy with. And the other thing is about being informed. This refers mainly to the nature of engagement and type of information that should be provided prior to seeking consent and also as part of the ongoing consent processes. The community should be informed. I think this is, it has no story sometimes, but some people do not give this like a priority to inform people on what's going to happen. Or if you have to maybe inform people, you only inform people on the benefits that are coming through maybe a certain project and things like that. And the information that should come to people should be on both sides, how the process will benefit the communities and how the process is also going to affect the communities in one or the other. Some things could also be bringing a lot of negative issues to the community. For example, preventing access of natural resources in some areas of community areas. It could also maybe change communities, maybe actions in terms of you are told to stop something that you're doing and you still want to continue doing this thing. So it can be moving communities in different directions. So the best information or the information that you should give to the person you are informing is all inclusive. It should not be divided according to how someone is going to benefit or not. You give them all the information. They should be informed. They should not be surprised at some point in 2, 3, 5 years of the process and maybe fighting the process. So I think this is also something that's very important. And then the last one is consent. This refers to the collective decision made by the right holders and reached through the customary decision-making processes of the affected communities or indigenous peoples and local communities. Yeah, the consent is, I think there are quite a number of tools that are discussing about the FPIC processes. And one of them is like the UNRIP, and the others. There are still other tools that we talk about. Maybe when we come to Kenya, we can talk about the Constitution of Kenya. There is the Community Land Act, which is also the Community Land Act of 2016, which takes this as one of the priority things that you could look at the FPIC process. So I think giving consent talks about the majority or all, not only the majority by voting, like for example, the Community Land Act in Kenya says 2/3 of the community must give consent. It's a process whereby the biggest part of the community must agree to it. Maybe the few that did not give consent or support the process might have not been there or things like that. But the minority are also considered. They also have right. Maybe you are not listening to them at the moment, but they are seeing something that is not going to benefit maybe them in the near future. the consent is also given according to the point number 1. It should be free, yeah? The consent should be given as a free thing. The way you give this freely to the community, they should also give the consent for free, without any kind of coercion, without intimidation, without manipulation. Manipulation can be also in many things, in many ways, where someone buys the community. That's through corruption. You pay them something to just agree on the process. And I think that's not the right way when the community needs to do decision-making process. This also talks about what works in this community. If it's an Indigenous peoples and local communities, there's the Indigenous peoples knowledge that always takes control of governance. I think they should also be given the priority to discuss in their own language, to discuss until they arrive to a point where they can do a customary decision making, like through their own customs. They can be able to do, they can be able to give a decision according to their own. And the consent should not always be a yes. They can discuss about it, and at the end of the day, they can say no to the process. And that should also be respected. It's not that because you're taking your time, you've used your own resources, you've asked a lot of things, you've talked to the community leaders, but their decision is the one that should be given the priority. Maybe, okay. There's something asking me a question, and I think this is a direct one. But maybe we can leave the questions to sometimes later, if that's okay. Okay, so at this point, I don't know if there is anyone who has a question up to that.
Hi, Ramson. I just informed them to drop the questions on the chat so that you can answer at the end of your presentation. If that's okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Yeah, and here I have also tried to put something about how is this process important? Sorry. I think the process is quite important, and a good epic process helps in very many things. It gives a lot of, should I say power, or not actually power, but it really solves a lot of problems that could be encountered by any kind of a project in future. And these are few points that I have brought forward. An important ethic process will help in the following: to mainstream inclusive and in decision making. That means everyone is reached in the whole community, and they could be able to make an inclusive decision making, which includes everyone in the community. What I mean by inclusive is that all genders are included in the discussion process, all ages. That means there is youth, there is the middle age, and there is also the old age. And there is also, in terms of gender, we also talk about gender in terms of being a youth and being an elder, and also in terms of women and youth in that process. Not only women, but not including girls, also girls should be included when it comes to gender issues, because women can be talked about representing gender, which in this case, I think, even in the CBD processes, we are talking about women and girls, and not only women. And then the other thing, a good ethic process also helps in benefit sharing and integrity in biodiversity conservation. We are mostly talking about biodiversity conservation nowadays. I think it's the problem that the world is facing. Conservation is trying to separate mostly the indigenous peoples who have been doing conservation without any kind of help, and bringing the scientific kind of knowledge that excludes these important people in nature or in biodiversity conservation as not important, as bad people, separating them and putting them away and giving room for biodiversity of conservation without them inside. This is an important process where they should be given integrity when it comes to biodiversity conservation. And the other thing is benefit sharing, of course. They should benefit equally, because some of the conservation projects are only promoting whoever is coming with a conservation kind of project, like, and not thinking about the communities themselves, whose the lands are going away. And then the other thing is land and natural resource management. It will also help because the communities will be in the picture. The other thing is it ensures respect of indigenous peoples and local communities. I think that's also a very important thing, because if you are not going to respect the indigenous peoples and local communities, at the end of the day, we might really have challenges of disrespecting their rights, maybe thinking that they are not important on the land and pushing them out. And so this is also important, and it ensures this right is fully given. It also helps in the recognition and protection of community lands and natural resources. And this is also something very important. I think during the colonial times, when the colonials, for example, came to Africa, they declared all land as it belongs to no one. And this was a rule that was put. I think maybe quite a number of people who are here, they know of something known as terra nullius. Terra nullius is the rule that was put by the colony and said the land belongs to no one. In that case, they could be able to change hands, give the land to anyone, mostly the farmers, which I think those are the most cases that we have in terms of historical land injustices that date back before we got independence in Africa and any other developing country, or any other country anyway. So they lost the land, and then some of the few lands that were left, they were not given entirety of ownership to the land and to the natural resources. Some of the natural resources were also taken to be governed by they were made public. They were for communities, and they still believe that they are their own lands and their own natural resources, but they are still told that the natural resources, like for example, the forests, the communities do not have rights to the forest, but that's where they get everything. That's where they get their own livelihood in terms of food and things like that. So in this case, this is also important. It's very important to talk about the protection of community lands, because the communities should have the right to land and the right to the natural resources. That's where I think securing the community land rights is the first process of giving any person, maybe secure livelihood. Because if there is no land, there is no also a security of livelihood, because you are not thinking of anywhere that could support your living, live alone, supporting where you can produce your own food in terms of farming, in terms of pastoralism, in terms of fishing, in terms of, there are also other activities like you can do mining. All this should be given to the community rights so that they can be able to. And then I stopped my sharing a bit, but I think this is much more deliberate. There is something I want us to do before we continue. I have discussed about the FPIC, and I have also discussed about how the FPIC process is important to the indigenous peoples and local communities. I don't want to be talking all alone. I would like to give a question. And the question that I would like to give is, what are the goals and objectives of the FPIC process? And in any group, maybe they can come up with only 2 points of goals and objectives. I know we don't have time, it's only 24 minutes to 12. I'll try to be very brief, and in each group, coming with 2 points is not really something big, and we should give maybe around 10 minutes maximum, or maybe 6 minutes, 7 minutes, so that we have a presentation. Yes, so I think everyone is back, and I don't want to take much of their time. And how many groups did we have? 3?
3.
I hope I don't want to take any much time. And is it possible to give everyone maybe 2 minutes maximum from each group to give us maybe the 2 points they came up with?
I could go first.
Yes. Which group is that? A.
Sorry, I didn't check, but I guess it's group A.
Okay.
What we came up with actually is that teamwork is number one, or rather, let me put it this way to say, we agreed that first is inclusivity, to ensure that there is a uniform transformation, that all stakeholders involved are part of the project and they are all aware of what is expected of them. And then the second is to foster teamwork, to ensure that everyone working on the project has a common goal, and through teamwork, we can be able to achieve conservation and sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
If I have left something out, perhaps my team members can kick in for a second just to clarify. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, the other group?
Hi, Ramson. I can't seem to find the person who provided context with regards to our group, but one of the major key things that transpired.
Which group is that, Esther?
It's B.
Okay.
Yes. They felt that there should be good governance systems when it comes to land tenure, to ensure that it includes indigenous people and local communities, especially when it comes to decision making. Thank you.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's a good one. And C?
For group C, we our 2 objectives were that one, there should be good rapport among all stakeholders. That's a good working relationship.
Yolanda, I think you can repeat the first point, sorry.
Okay, sorry. Our 2 objectives.
I'm not sure if it's only me that I could not hear you, Yolanda. Esther, can you hear?
Sorry, I think my network is weak.
I think there's a problem with her network.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. If we have
Then I think
somebody,
it's
if we have somebody from the same group, they could give us what they felt about the objectives and also the goals. I can see there's nobody coming up, so probably Ramson, you could try answering to the questions that were on the chat. I'm not sure if you
yes.
could.
Sorry, I will again share my screen for a few seconds, maybe.
All right, all right.
And I will share this soon. So the goals and objectives of an FP process, I think one, it ensures sovereignty of indigenous peoples and local communities over their lands and natural resources, and it upholds their rights and freedom to grant, refuse consent for the implementation of a project thereon. It does not only talk about giving consent, they can also give consent to withdraw projects that were consented. So it means that you should also give room for, if this is not going to happen, then they can withdraw their consent. The other thing, it will establish a very good framework of managing relations between IPLCs and other actors, including government, development partners, private sector, so as to ensure the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities are respected, secure and protected. The other thing is it will also ensure the effectiveness and meaningful participation of the full diversity of groups and comprised of indigenous peoples and local communities, including traditional institutions, elders, women, women groups, youth, everyone in the community anyway, in the implementation of any projects on their lands. And the other thing, it also ensures traditional procedures for decision making and communication, and the alignment of logistical consideration to feed traditional livelihoods and the production cycle of indigenous peoples and local communities. I think all these processes are really quite important, and I will share this to you guys to, that's maybe important, I don't know. And then the other thing, it will also ensure proper identification of a community and a clear understanding of its composition, diversity, priority, and needs relative to the project, including their concerns and preferences, which regards to representatives and institutions through which they wish to interact and negotiate. And thank you very much. I think we'll go to the second level, which I did not want to take much of your time. I know you crossed to 12, and I think I have 6 minutes to 12 to answer the questions. Maybe if possible, Esther, could you read the questions? I'm stopping to share my screen.
All right. Thank you so much for giving us a feel of indigenous people and local communities, and also providing us with the your insights as well. So the first question comes from Bogini from Burkina Faso, and he's asking, you talked about land tenure regime at the colonial time. Now the land has diverse owners, including private owners, individuals, and the state. Which of the land tenures contribute to natural resource conservation?
I think that's a good question. And I think that one way I can go back to the colonial era, and also bring it back to the experiences that we have currently, and not only at the community level, but also in our own discussions. Yes, the land has been declared tetra nullis. Land belongs to no one during those days of colonial, and the land could be given out, like dishing out the land that belongs to communities without asking them a question, because the land belongs to no one. And this is how the indigenous communities lost all their territories. This is how their land became public. That's how you have the government, not government, but yeah, we have government land, just public land. We also have private lands, where it also started at the colonial times. Some people were given tokens because of fighting very nicely in terms of being in the army, and so you are given a token as a piece of land. And they promoted farming in terms of ranching, probably in areas like Kenya and areas, not only Kenya, I think quite a number of across the globe. And yeah, which raised a lot of conflicts of today. And the other thing is, during the current government, it's not colonial anymore. We have private land. We have categories of land so far. We still have public, we still have private, and we still have communal. Those are the three kind of tenure systems we have. And the land that's viable for biodiversity conservation, I cannot talk of which land is important so much and which is not. At least some land that people are still controlling because they're using it collectively. Communities are still holding quite a lot of land. Globally, indigenous peoples and local communities hold and control 80% of the globe. So that means the land that's available for biodiversity conservation, if we may talk about the land that's occupied by, that's controlled by indigenous peoples and local communities, still the biggest chunk of land that we have. So it can also be the best and the best land to still talk about biodiversity conservation. We have also private lands. That land you cannot control the use. Even when the communities today subdivide the land, you cannot ask an individual person to what to do with their land. They can decide to build an estate. They can decide to demarcate it further and give into small plots, sell it. They can decide to do farming in terms of crop farming, which is not maybe going to support inclusive kind of land use, which includes wildlife, which includes other kind of land use. So land for communities is still viable for biodiversity protection. We may talk about how they own it and how they use it.
Thank you so much for the response. I'm not sure if we still have more time because we already crossing the next hour. But one thing that stood out from your presentation is about information, because in most cases, most of the local community, indigenous people and local communities are lacking access to the information that they need when it comes to implementation of the models on area-based conservation. And I'm happy that that was one of the things that we were pushing for in the post-2020 GBF, and also something that came from you as the host, from the horse's mouth. Thank you so much, Ramson, for your presentation. If there are more questions, you can answer them on our chat if you're still going to be present in the chat, but I can see people responding and saying the presentation was insightful, and we are much grateful to you for finding time off your busy schedule and coming to share your perspectives with us this morning. Thank you so much. And I'm passing the program back to Priska right now. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I also appreciate being here. And I think if there are any kind of questions, I may not be able to stay further, but I think I can share my email, which you can reach me out and we can also exchange. And yeah, I think, yeah, information is good when we talk about conservation, because some people are not getting the right information and very bad decisions take place and affect them at the end of the day. So thank you, and that's my email. You can reach me out.
Thank you so much, Ransom, for your presentation and just talking in detail about what free and prior informed consent is about. And for just raising that whole point of ensuring that the framework protects the rights of IPOCs. When we're looking at the 30 by 30 initiative, it is a good plan if you're looking at it from a scientific perspective. But at the same time, we also need to be mindful that, you know, it also affects people as well. So protecting biodiversity at the expense of people who also live in those areas, I don't think would be a good thing.